Good evening and welcome. My name is Cheryl Pauls and I serve as president of Canadian Mennonite University. And such an honor to be here on this lovely evening together with all of you. And on this lovely evening in this lovely space, there might be some oddities of how the sun moves and where you feel like you want to be seated or not. So no offense to our guest this evening if people are kind of playing musical chairs here and moving around a bit so that they feel comfortable. CMU, as an Anabaptist university in the Anabaptist faith tradition, is a place that honors the world as God's creation and all things in it. And we are grateful to be part of a place where we are learning all the time what it is to honor the people who have stewarded these good lands for many times long before many of us in this room became part of this place called Turtle Island. And so we're grateful for the Covenant of Treaty 1, a treaty that we are learning to live into, what it means to be treaty people. We're grateful for the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota and Métis peoples who have stewarded the land and the waters so that this can be a hospitable place for us to live and learn. We're grateful also for Treaty 3, where our clean, clear drinking water and the abundance of it in Winnipeg, where that comes from. Now, this lecture this evening is entitled Imagination, Courage, and Resilience. I will say those are three of my favorite words, and so I very much look forward to this with Dr. Emily Welty. Want to say that every year during Canadian School of Peacebuilding, we do this lecture, and so we're grateful that you have all joined us to listen to Dr. Welty this evening. At this point, I'm going to introduce Dr. Wendy Kroeker, who is Assistant Professor of Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies at CMU and also as Academic Director of Canadian School of Peacebuilding, to come and to introduce this evening's guest lecturer. So, Wendy, please.
Thanks, Cheryl, for your opening remarks. And welcome to all of you, because of course we can have conversations by ourselves, but doing it in a community with the diversity that this group here represents is wonderful. So you are here this evening for the Canadian School of Peacebuilding Community Lectureship Series. And this is CMU's way of offering the opportunity for you to sample the amazing breadth of scholarship and world engagement that happens here every June with the Canadian School of Peacebuilding. And to learn more about the options for 2020, we have already picked some amazing people for 2020. Please see Thomason back there if you can wave for a brochure for next year's options. You'll find them equally as exciting as this year. I also want to say a welcome to those of you that we cannot see out there. We are live streaming this event, and so there are people in churches and homes who have gathered together to watch together, and so welcome to all of you. This year, of course, is no exception to the opportunities that we have with CSOP. Dr. Emily Welty, she and I are friends and colleagues through some common organizations that we work on together. We're on a board together. Emily is an academic, an ecumenist, and an artist living and working in New York City. She is the director of Peace and Justice Studies at Pace University, where she teaches classes focusing on nonviolence, humanitarianism, reconciliation, and transitional justice. Her research focuses on religious dimensions of peacebuilding with an emphasis on humanitarianism and nuclear disarmament, as well as nonviolent social movements. The Mennonites and international development specialists in the room might also be interested to know that her PhD dissertation was on the role of faith-based NGOs in peacemaking and development in Uganda and Kenya, using Mennonite Central Committee work as her case study. She is the Vice Moderator of the World Council of Churches Commission on International Affairs and is the chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. She is also a key representative of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, where she works on faith-based engagement in nuclear disarmament. That campaign, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is a coalition of non-government organizations in 100 countries promoting adherence to and implementation of the United Nations Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty. Emily is someone who seeks to combine her scholarship and her activism. She is the co-author of Unity in Diversity, Interfaith Dialogue in the Middle East, Occupying Political Science, the Occupy Wall Street Movement from New York to the World, and her most recent one, Peace and Justice Studies, Critical Pedagogy. Her upcoming sabbatical year will focus her on the arts and peace building. She is, in the midst of all that amazing activism and scholarship, just a real human being. She is an avid hiker, currently trying to hike the entire New York portion of the Appalachian Trail and visit all of the U.S. national parks. She is also a playwright. Google her name, and works with 2 different theater companies in New York City. Her work and passions take her around the world and to here in Winnipeg. We are grateful to have you here, Emily. Welcome to CMU and to this podium.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. It is a real joy to be with you this evening, and I am really inspired by this very beautiful space. I think this might be the most beautiful backdrop I've ever spoken in front of, and gorgeous windows. As Wendy said, I spend a lot of time thinking about storytelling. When I'm not being a professor or an ICAN activist, I'm a playwright, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what a good story is capable of doing. Challenging us, inspiring us, scaring us sometimes, healing us. And so I think that there are 2 different ways to tell the story of nuclear disarmament. One way that I could tell you the story of nuclear disarmament is to show you a map, there's some really good technology around this, about what a nuclear weapon would do if it was detonated in your city. There's good technology that can show what the damage of a nuclear weapon would do if it was detonated here on campus. You can choose the ground to zero. And how far the immediate evaporation of human bodies would spread, how far the radiation would be carried by wind, who would die of burns, of cancer, how the rivers and the land would be poisoned. But that's not the story that I'm going to tell. For some people, that's the story that makes them feel that this issue is urgent and worth working on. But I feel uncomfortable with that story, because it makes me feel like unless I threaten you with death, you don't have the empathy to be moved into action. And I hope that this is underestimating you and your expansive capacity to empathize. Because the other way to tell this story of nuclear disarmament is to make it a story of courage, imagination, and resilience, to remind you that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed more than 200,000 people in 1945. And I live in the United States, the only country that has dropped not 1, but 2 nuclear weapons. That happened a long time before I was born. I didn't make that decision, but the effects of that decision are my birthright. The obligation towards repair that existed before I was born, and that is my duty by nature of my birth and citizenship to address. Those who survived those 2 bombings, the Habakasha as they're called, have suffered a wide spectrum of radiation-related diseases, including cancers, heart disease, and infertility. And in fact, the health impacts of these bombings have also been passed down to their children and grandchildren. So from the very beginning of the nuclear age, the harm of nuclear weapons has been widespread, indiscriminate, and multinational. Between 1945 and 1996, which actually feels quite recent, nuclear weapons were tested in 17 different countries, with fallout spreading to Norway, Sweden, and here in Canada. Nuclear weapons-related accidents have happened in Greenland and Spain, as well as in the possessor states. And uranium is mined in 20 countries around the world, including this one, often with serious risks to people and the environment. So when you think about the United States, my government detonated more than 1,000 nuclear devices in 945 tests within or above the continental United States, mostly at what's called the Nevada test site. And the federal government recognizes people in 12 Western states that have developed serious illnesses after exposure to radiation. So this is just to establish that nuclear weapons are not just solely a threat that is lodged in the past. There are currently 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, many of them on high alert and able to be launched in minutes. The vast majority of those belong to the United States and Russia. There's a horrifying history of accidents, close calls, mechanical and human error that continues today. In many ways, I like to remind people that in the United States, we're most under threat from our own nuclear weapons. People are often asking me, like, are you afraid that another country is going to fire a nuclear weapon at you? The harm is so much more likely to come from the misfire of your own nuclear weapons. They're a very inherently unstable piece of machinery that can fail just like any other piece of technology. For those of you that are in the classroom this week, as we struggle with how to get the overhead projector to work or how to connect to the internet or how to use our own phones, there aren't magical pieces of technology that are fail-safe when we are talking about nuclear technology. But I think the effects of a nuclear detonation are so horrifying that our brain can't really actually take them in. It seems really abstract or just a generalized horror. So I think it's always important to say, when we are talking about threatening the use of nuclear weapons, it's not an abstract sense. It is to threaten the slaughter of millions of people, animals, and plants. It's to condemn babies that aren't yet born to lives of intense suffering. Setsuko Thurlow, who is a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing, accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN. And she said, each person who died had a name. Each person was loved by someone. I think that's such a very specific way of thinking about what we lose. So this is all very upsetting and feels very intractable. But given the global extent and the potential harm of nuclear weapons in use, there's also opportunities for solidarity across national boundaries. And there's a story that we can tell about hope and determination and love. So the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, was founded in 2007 to try and learn from the success of global civil society advocacy on landmines and cluster munitions. With member organizations around the world, we have successfully pushed governments to make the conversation about the environmental, humanitarian, and human rights dimensions of nuclear weapons, instead of always focusing that conversation on purely a security dimension. Most governments around the world see nuclear weapons as expensive, dangerous, and a threat to their people. They're angry and fed up with the nuclear-armed states for failing to fulfill the repeated promises that they've made to disarm. The 5 largest nuclear weapon states are legally obligated to disarm and get rid of their nuclear weapons under the same 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that they're often using to condemn other countries who seek nuclear arsenals. So as a result, in 2017, 122 governments negotiated and adopted a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons at the UN in New York. This very treaty I hold in my hands. Those of us working on ICAN's advocacy were persuading governments to make the treaty the world's first nuclear arms control agreement to frame nuclear weapons in moral, ethical, humanitarian, human rights, and environmental terms, particularly stressing the gendered impact of radiation and the particular harm to indigenous peoples. The treaty establishes a categorical prohibition against nuclear weapons, seeking to stigmatize them as unacceptable. Most of the weapons that we currently consider pariahs, like chemical and biological weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions, were first banned by a smaller group of countries, often led by those without large arsenals. So this is the same strategy that we've used in ICAN. ICAN and the 122 governments adopting the treaty decided to apply this same strategy by establishing also a framework for assisting victims of nuclear weapons use and testing and remediating contaminated environments. This is one of the strongest disarmament treaties on gender. It recognizes the different impacts of radiation on the bodies of men and women, as well as calling for the broader participation of women in disarmament negotiations. The treaty also recognizes nuclear colonialism by its definitive acknowledgement of the suffering of indigenous people. So in December 2017, ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. I was very humbled and grateful to attend the ceremony along with ICAN activists, and it's really enabled us to start a much broader conversation in public about the ongoing dangers and harms of nuclear weapons. One of the aspects that makes the Nobel Peace Prize quite different than other awards in the world is that you get it for something that is still in process. It's not a book that you published or a discovery that you made or a Broadway show that is up and running and out of your hands. We won the Nobel Peace Prize for believing that another world is possible, for firmly, persistently advocating for a vision of a world without nuclear weapons, and for helping to craft a treaty to make that a reality. But, as someone always wants to point out to me, there are still nuclear weapons in the world. So what really did you do, they sometimes ask. What does it mean to win in a world that is still so unsafe? I think this is part of the role of imagination. We had the audacity and the courage to keep insisting that there was another way that the world could be. ICAN had the competence to understand that what was happening at the UN, and by partnering with hundreds of diplomats, we had the nerve to change the game. But fair enough, it is still a work in progress. We are still working to make the treaty a binding piece of international law. The treaty will come into force when 50 nation states sign and ratify the treaty. Right now we have 70 countries that have signed it and 23 countries that have signed and ratified. So we feel very encouraged that we're making fast progress on this. But the work continues. We are still lobbying, we're still making phone calls, we're still writing and speaking and working towards signature and ratification. And this can be quite a daunting challenge that continues to require our tenacity and courage. So when I'm thinking about courage, it is important for you to know that by nature I am a people pleaser. When I was in kindergarten, my teacher one Friday, said goodbye to us for the weekend and said, "Enjoy some Saturday morning cartoons." Now, I was not aware that there were Saturday morning cartoons. That was not part of my family's tradition at all, and it had totally escaped my notice that there were such things as a Saturday morning cartoon. So I interpreted this as homework. And my mom ended up having to call my kindergarten teacher because I was inconsolable about the fact that I had homework that was due, and my mom couldn't actually piece together that this was like a blithe greeting that had been offered, and I was like just wanting to make sure that I had done the right thing. So I've been quite wrapped up from a very early age about pleasing authority figures. And I think that is probably true for a lot of us that end up in academia. So in many ways, that people-pleasing response has served me very well. But the work of the world also demands that you learn to say, "I disagree," to be willing to not please people. And much of our work in ICAN depends on the idea of stigmatization and reshaping the norm around nuclear weapons in order to tell a different story. And in order to stigmatize something, you have to be able to name it. You have to learn how to interrupt the narrative, and you have to be willing to disrupt, to hear who is being silenced and to stand with them. And that will not always be easy. People, at least in my experience, do not always welcome having their perspectives challenged. Their response may not always be, thanks, great. Thank you so much for disagreeing with me. So to use the phrasing of feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, we have to learn to be a killjoy sometimes and to actually embrace that perspective. When you see an example of white supremacy or patriarchy, you need to be able to name it, even if that means you're engaging in disruption. And it takes a certain amount of courage to be willing to lose friends sometimes. This is not to say that you cannot have friends with whom you disagree, and I'm not underestimating the friends and colleagues that you gain when you engage in struggle. But I think that we need to acknowledge that the calculus is not perfect, and we need to develop the courage to make gains, but also the resilience to suffer losses. So you have to teach yourself to be willful, to assert your stance, and to stand in the river and not be swept away by it. But if you can do that, you can change history, and you can be part of the history for the people who come after us. It's quite easy, I think, to sit on the sidelines, bemoaning and critiquing how bad the world is. It takes some real courage and imagination to show up and try to do something about it. I got cornered by the person I'm going to call a well-meaning bloviator at a party the other night. And I think you all know this guy. You don't actually know this particular guy, but you definitely know this type of person. This was a stranger, and we were chatting, and the bar was kind of loud, so he says, I'm a pessimist. Everything is getting worse, and he's shouting like the environment is getting so much worse, and poverty and militarism, and I'm feeling myself outwardly, I'm nodding, I'm saying yes, but internally I'm starting to think like there's something slightly off about this situation. So I said, what are you doing about it? He's like, what? I said, maybe the bar is very loud and he can't hear me. So I decided to rephrase. I said, what's one small thing that you're doing about this? So he starts up again with the everything is really bad speech. So now I'm thinking, am I supposed to argue with him that everything is really good? Am I being too direct with asking him what he's going to do about it? So I said, again, I rephrased, trying to people please a little bit. I say, what's the one thing that you think we could do together about all the things that are bad in the world? Just one small thing that might be hopeful. He kind of yells back. He's like, I'm not hopeful. I'm a pessimist. I don't want to be hopeful. And so I did something that I think is pretty rare for a polite, people-pleasing Mennonite. I just turned around and walked away. I didn't make an excuse for something that I just remembered to do. I just walked away. Because honestly, you know what? Of course we need analysis, and of course it's all rather worrying and terrible right now. But if you are totally disinterested in taking action, or if it gives you some sort of weird pleasure to stay on the sidelines and not even try to make the world a better place, then I'm going to go find people who will. But please do not dump your self-satisfied nihilism on me and then try to tell yourself that you're somehow on the side of good. I don't have time to accept that. I've also been thinking a lot this summer about the nature of vulnerability and the relationship between vulnerability and courage. Thinking about where we feel exposed and what we can learn from it, and where are the places that we actually get paralyzed. It's quite an act of vulnerability, actually, to create something new, to reimagine the status quo, or to just sometimes say, I don't understand what's happening here. The system that governs nuclear weapons is complex and inaccessible, and that is not a mistake. That's not an oversight. The governance structures are designed to prevent ordinary participation. The nuclear weapon states do not want you to feel invited into the room. They're not going to check in and take a poll with how you're feeling. The systems are designed to make you feel that nuclear weapons are inevitable, that there's no alternative. But that's a colossal failure of the imagination. We know that it's possible to live in a world without nuclear weapons because that simply was the world until the development of nuclear weapons in 1942. We know it's possible to be a country that doesn't produce nuclear weapons because we're standing in one right now. I'm standing, you're sitting. We know it's possible to be a country that doesn't rely on nuclear weapons for their security because 122 nations, a majority of countries in the world, are willing to do so. Canada is not on that list, but I have tremendous hope that you will be. It is disconcerting to me when the nuclear weapon states use the language of vulnerability, and particularly avoiding vulnerability, to describe their refusal to disarm. It casts vulnerability as exposure or as flaw or as weakness. And part of this has also reinforced very rigid gender norms that are embedded in the way that we talk about weapons and disarmament. That the courage to possess weapons of mass destruction is somehow manly, that it means that you're strong, and that to demand a world without nuclear weapons is somehow feminine, weak, and emotional. Recentering the conversation means reclaiming how we think and talk about vulnerability. On one hand, I think it means that our conscience has to be activated beyond pity and into radical solidarity with those who have had their bodies and their lives shattered by nuclear testing and detonation. We have to ask not only who is threatened, but who has already suffered and who profits from the suffering of others. And there is not space for neutrality here. Bystanding and pretending that nuclear weapons don't affect you or are too complex for you to understand or are somehow just the way that things are, please understand that all of these legitimize the nuclear industry. Your ambivalence strengthens those who are already strong and denigrates the suffering of those who have gone before us. So for a church or a community or a nation to claim that they do not have an official stance on nuclear weapons is already to take a stance. I spent the first 2 years that I was working on nuclear disarmament for the World Council of Churches feeling extremely stupid and out of place. I didn't understand how the NPT worked or what the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty meant, or even really where I was and was not allowed to go in the halls of the United Nations. I felt vulnerable, disposable, and invisible in meetings. Voicing dissent against these complex systems felt impossible, and I lived with the fear that I would be in a meeting with a diplomat and that my moral argument that nuclear weapons violate our conscience would be met with derision because I didn't understand complicated international law. And to some degree, that was true. But the moment I started to claim my own sense of power at the United Nations was in a meeting when I was told by one diplomat that it was nice that I was so passionate, but that I needed to understand that this was a complicated and a slow step-by-step process, and that really what they were doing, which was doing nothing, was the only way forward. We in ICAN have been told a lot that we are too emotional, to which I say yes. I think it is absolutely necessary to be emotional when we are talking about the destruction of everything we love. That's exactly the right time and place to be emotional. And I find it alarming if people who are making the decisions about this don't have emotions about it. I think maybe that's where we need to talk about who has emotions and who doesn't. Once I had the vocabulary and the legal terms to talk about nuclear weapons in a more complicated way, I felt more confident and I became harder to dismiss. But that is not a prerequisite for engaging in this conversation. You do not need a law degree or training in nuclear physics to be willing to say with conviction and clarity, this is wrong. It's wrong to threaten to kill millions of people. It's wrong to test military technology on people that we've deemed less than human. It's wrong to refuse to apologize for causing thousands of deaths. And it is wrong, both morally and factually, to claim that nuclear weapons were necessary to end the Second World War. It takes courage to ask the question, what if we just got rid of nuclear weapons? What if we don't modernize our nuclear weaponry? What if we didn't care if another country had more nuclear weapons than we do? And what if we refused to be protected under the US nuclear umbrella? A solid thanks but no thanks. And we don't have to stretch our imaginations too far because a majority of nations in the world are already doing this. There's a fear of looking naive if you push back against the logic of nuclear weapons, that you'll look foolish or ill-informed. But strangely, no one seems worried or afraid of looking violent when we continue to maintain nuclear arsenals. And I'm interested in that question particularly. Why is it seen as more courageous to live with nuclear weapons than it is to live without them? I think that we are so entrenched in the status quo, in the way that things are, that it's hard to imagine something different. And this is why the role of imagination is so important. American abolitionist, activist, and writer Frederick Douglass wrote, quote, "It is the picture of life contrasted with the real that makes criticism possible. Where there's no criticism, there's no progress. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this ability is the secret of their power and of their achievements. They see what ought to be by the reflection of what is, and they endeavor to remove the contradiction." End quote. I think it's easy to dismiss the role of the arts in advocacy work, but the role of imagination feels critical to creating other worlds that are free from the kinds of social injustice and violence that we struggle against. And what strikes me about this Frederick Douglass quote is that he suggests that criticism is made possible first by being able to name a world that doesn't yet exist. The work that he says can be done by poets and prophets. And by naming this, you're able to live into the contradictions between how we live now and how we want to live. There is a brilliant musical on Broadway right now called Hadestown, and it retells the old myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. The musical reinforces the importance of keeping each other alive by telling stories, by imagining how the world can be, and by naming the gift of artists to see how you can see how the world could be in spite of the way it is. I think that these stories that we tell also help to define us, that storytelling is another kind of truth-telling. The story that you tell will determine whether you are the guy shouting in the bar that everything is doomed, or you're the brave climate justice activist kids that are striking to get action on the climate crisis. Stories help to remind us that we're not alone, and art helps us to develop a collective response to individualized pain. We can reckon with our suffering, both ours and our neighbors. Art also gives you a place that you can have the power to laugh at dictators, which may eventually give you the strength to defy authority. Making meaning through sharing stories and making art is something that is stronger and older than the weapons we've created to destroy each other. And I think that people of faith are deeply familiar with this power. The prophetic imagination helps us build the bridge between the way the world is and the way that the world can be. People of faith know what it means to articulate the difference between the world that God intends and the world we live in, and to answer God's desire for us to repair the world. God, by the way, did not create nuclear weapons. Humans did. Continuing to work from both a place of faith and activism has been part of the role I've also played in ICAN, to keep reminding ICAN that religion is important and to keep reminding religious communities that this issue demands our attention. As Wendy said, I'm currently serving as the Vice Moderator of the World Council of Churches International Affairs Commission and moderating WCC's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. WCC is an international ecumenical organization made up of more than 500 million Christians in 110 countries. We have a long history of engaging in public theology and advocacy. In this context, what we've done is frame nuclear weapons not just as a moral issue, but as a religious one. From the perspective of Christianity, we make the argument that nuclear weapons don't just represent a really bad idea, but that they violate our core identities of people of faith, that it is a sin to use or threaten to use or possess nuclear weapons. There's also a significant interfaith component to the work that we do. By working with Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and Hindus, we come together to draft joint statements that say, whatever your faith tradition, nuclear weapons violate the fundamental tenets of what we say that we believe. If our holy texts say that we need to love our neighbor, that we are obligated to engage in the repair of the world, that there is something fundamentally sacred about human dignity, then I don't think we can support any notion of security that's based on nuclear deterrence. We need to live out our faith by openly and rigorously opposing nuclear weapons, and we need to make a common stand on this issue, even if we are divided theologically or politically on other issues. Last spring, I delivered a statement at the United Nations that represented the consensus of 57 different faith-based communities. Consensus is a very difficult thing to achieve with 57 different faith communities. But here are the things that we can agree together. Together, we can recognize the fearfulness that has driven nations to take up arms against threats to their security. But we can also collectively choose to face that fear not with additional posturing or intimidation, but with continued action for a world based on trust and equality. Our different faith-based traditions have given us both the imperative to continue this humanitarian disarmament work, even, and perhaps especially, when there are so many voices of despair and pessimism. We all share and value the basic human right to live in a world free from the fear of total destruction and in an environment free from contamination. The indiscriminate and destructive capacity of nuclear weapons makes them wholly incompatible with our faiths and requires our advocacy for their total and complete elimination. Our diverse religious traditions demand that we care for and accompany those who are suffering. We continue to mourn together the devastating impacts of nuclear testing and nuclear detonations on human bodies, human communities, and the planet. And we believe together that there should be some sort of accountability for those who cause human suffering, that the nuclear horrors of the past demand that we act in solidarity and support for all victims. So how then do we develop the resilience to keep doing this? In the work of ICAN, the role of friendship seems important to name. This is not to say that all of us within ICAN are friends, and certainly this is not to claim that we don't have conflict. In fact, sometimes I think, particularly because we have friendships, we're able to weather some of our more intense conflicts with one another. There are also a very important role of the relationships between the diplomats that negotiated the treaty and the activists that pushed for it. And I think that in the future, this is going to be a very interesting case study about how partnerships between diplomats and civil society might look. Sharing information, disagreeing with each other, and continuing to dialogue in spite of conflict, and helping each other actually weather criticism were all really important aspects to this work. And sometimes that was as simple as warmly greeting each other in the halls of the UN, grabbing a coffee, if to say nothing more than, I see you, this work is hard, and we have to keep doing it. Nonviolent theory suggests that the relationships between activists and their opponents are also key. An ongoing advocacy challenge has been how to direct our work as we work for signature and ratification of this treaty. How much do we concentrate on states without nuclear weapons, and how much do we focus on those who possess them? And being from a possessor state, that troubles me and challenges me a lot. I ask myself a lot if I'm doing enough to build relationships with the US diplomats, or whether my deep moral, spiritual, intellectual, and emotional rejection of their boss means that I can't empathize even with the decision to be a US diplomat right now. For me, resilience in this sense sometimes just means being seen. I don't have hope of the United States abandoning their nuclear weapons overnight, though I would welcome it if they do. I think a lot of times, to be honest, I'm just praying that we don't use them, which, to be honest, is a very, very, very low bar. But at the same time, I'm also trying to humanize the US diplomats and to humanize myself to them. There's a cafe in the UN where both diplomats and civil society advocates tend to get coffee and sandwiches, called the Vienna Cafe. And I recently had a very simple but extended conversation with one of the most senior US nuclear disarmament diplomats about granola bars. I don't think that this conversation converted his heart to nuclear disarmament, or even that my argument that peanut butter granola bars are clearly superior to dried fruit ones moved him. But for me, this conversation was about something else. It was not about granola bars. It was about asserting simply that conversations can happen, that the nuclear weapon states are not untouchable, that diplomats are human, and that my body and my opinion has the same right to be in this space as theirs do, that I cannot and I will not be invisible. It was about humanizing my opponent and building my own resilience to continue to do the work. We are small, but we are mighty. The first way that the powers that be will try to discourage you is by reminding you that you are small. It's a terribly ungenerous thing when a big entity names the weakness of a smaller adversary. But it's also a sign that you're being effective. For a while, the nuclear weapon states told us, as activists, that we were wasting our time in pursuing a ban on nuclear weapons, that this was a terribly stupid plan and that we should be ignored. It was once the treaty gained traction that they decided we weren't stupid, we were dangerous. And I think that's a significant shift. Nuclear weapons are not inevitable. Like any oppressive social construction, they were created by humans and they can be dismantled by the fierce love and determination that this is not the world that we were meant to live in. The same scientific competence that invented nuclear weapons can be used to dismantle them. The billions of dollars that are currently spent on modernizing and maintaining our nuclear arsenals can be spent on alleviating poverty and investing in green technology. And I really believe that when the world changes for good, it is because ordinary people find a quiet, clear voice within them that cannot accept injustice. When the world changes for good, it is because people decide to exercise a generosity of spirit and a depth of presence that can step back from the desire to annihilate our opponents, to destroy them in the way that they wish to destroy us. I get asked a lot why I'm not working on other issues. Don't I care about climate or immigration? And I think that it's important to say that we also don't need to be choosing between struggles for justice, and we certainly shouldn't be pitting them against one another. Working against nuclear weapons doesn't mean that I don't care about the violence of occupation or mass incarceration or the ongoing violence against women here or worldwide or the devastating structures of capitalism that extract profit from bodies of marginalized people. So if your issue is offering hospitality to refugees or challenging ongoing gentrification in communities of color, standing up against deportations, or working to avert the climate crisis, this is not me telling you to stop doing those things and work on nuclear weapons. But what I am telling you is that if you are standing on the sidelines, if you are more focused on the prosperity of yourself and whoever you've decided is in your inner circle, then it's time to step out and commit yourself to a broader vision of what it means to be human. So what then can we do? One of the really practical things that you can do is look at where your money is invested. Ask your financial institution to divest from nuclear weapons and move your money if they don't. There's a wonderful resource called Don't Bank on the Bomb that helps you in very practical ways think about moving your money away from banks that are supporting the production and development of nuclear weapons. This campaign has identified hundreds of banks and pension funds and insurance companies and asset managers around the world with substantial investments in nuclear arms producers, as well as identifying banks that don't support nuclear production. Beyond your own personal conception of finances, encourage the institutions that you love to implement ethical investment policies. That's a critical way to make sure that your lives and your resources are reflecting your values. Another important thing that you can do is push for nuclear weapons-free cities and get your city to join the ICAN Cities Appeal. Individual cities and states, even if they are in countries that are not signing the treaty, can indicate compliance the same way that many cities have done with the Paris Climate Agreement. So Paris and Washington, D.C. and Sydney have all signed up, as well as many, many other cities. And my understanding from my short time in Winnipeg so far is that many people in Winnipeg feel a little bit of competition with other Canadian cities. I'm a stranger in a strange land, but I have noticed this as an ethnographer in the last few days. So I don't want to provoke you here, but I just want to let you know that Toronto has already joined the city's appeal, but you can make it happen here in Winnipeg very easily. And I can help you with that if you're interested in taking that on. But just as a challenge, your competitor, it seems, Toronto, made this happen. You can ask your religious communities to publicly speak out on the issue of nuclear weapons. We are always looking for more interfaith partners in issuing statements. I am 100% the right person to come and talk to if you want to be part of the next interfaith statement that we'll do. Of course, please push the government of Canada to sign and ratify the treaty. And even before they do that, ask them to engage in victim assistance and environmental remediation. They don't have to have signed the treaty to engage in the victim assistance and environmental remediation. Canada has been a leader on this work in terms of landmines. And I think it is that gives us every courage and every conviction that Canada can and will be part of this treaty as well. Another thing that you can do is show up at anti-nuclear protests and engage in direct action. Two of my dearest friends, Sister Ardith Platy and Sister Carol Gilbert, they are profound and fierce Dominican nuns, have spent the last 40 years of their lives working against nuclear weapons, and they've spent many years in prison as a result of their actions. Publicly supporting these people of faith who are taking a stand with their own bodies is an important action of solidarity. Right now, there are activists on trial as part of the Kings Bay plowshare movements in the United States. They're currently in jail and awaiting the second phase of their trial. So I'd also say keep them in your thoughts and prayers and keep asking what's happening with them. Nothing is changed by throwing up our hands and claiming that the task in front of us is impossible. So I think that there is a very clear and simple choice. Do you want to live in a world that is continually threatened by the annihilation of everything that you love, or do you believe that another world is possible? We don't always win. We don't always have the moments where it all feels worth it. We don't always win the Nobel Peace Prize. But we always have the option to love each other fiercely, and we always have the obligation to struggle for each other. So I wanted to mark the end of our time together this evening with a little call and response, which again comes from the musical Hadestown. The characters, to toast each other, use the phrase, "May the world we dream about be the world we live in now." And I think this phrase combines the elements of courage, imagination, and resilience that I've reflected on tonight. So I'm hoping that when I say in a minute, "May the world we dream about," you will respond with, "Be the world we live in now." Ready? May the world we dream about be the world we live in now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. You have been direct with us. You have inspired us, and I think you provoked us to think about it's okay to be dangerous and have suggested ways to do that. I am going to right now say goodbye, cyber world, those who are watching by live streaming. Yes, I don't know where they are, but wherever you are, I'm saying goodbye to you folks who are live streaming. Thank you for joining us thus far. And please join in with our next series of lectures that we have here. Those of you here, please don't leave. As you know, if you have been to a seat before, that we give opportunity for you to ask questions. we hope that